Hello, one and all. Welcome to another episode of MMA Vision Analysis. This one, I'm here to talk about Israel Adesanya's comments on Francis Ngannou and the UFC's treatment of Francis Ngannou. But before getting started, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and click that notification to get all of this that is new from this channel, your channel, the one and only MMA Vision Analysis. Prior to the Anthony Joshua fight, all the way up until the Tyson Fury fight, and till this day, in all honesty, Francis Ngannou is and always has been considered one of the most terrifying heavyweights that another heavyweight can get in a ring with, or an octagon, or wherever Francis Ngannou is fighting at this point. I believe the 36, 37-year-old. Francis Ngannou is one of the most explosive fighters that the UFC has ever seen. You don't believe that? All you have to do is go back and watch the way that he put out a Jairzinho Rozenstruik. One of the nastiest knockouts I've ever seen. And that night, you can hear the knockout when Ngannou was able to land that punch on Jairzinho Rozenstruik. Rozenstruik is no joke himself. And for anybody to put Jairzinho Rozenstruik the way that Ngannou did, it's just really, you don't really see that happening to many heavyweights. Obviously, the former UFC heavyweight champion, I've actually said it before, and I'll say it again. At some point, obviously, Stipe Miocic had the win over Ngannou. Aside from that, at some point, it looked like nobody can truly stand toe-to-toe with Francis Ngannou. Because if the dude lands a punch on you, it is over. That power translated directly to his brief boxing career, a boxing career in which he was propelled directly to the top of the boxing world. His first opponent is arguably one of the best heavyweights, not only of the past 20 years, but of all time. Tyson Fury, that is. The guy that has a rematch. I believe they have something. Well, there was talks of a rematch with Alexander Usyk. I think Usyk has Joshua next, if I'm not mistaken. Speaking of Joshua, Ngannou also went in there against Joshua, and that's where I think Francis Ngannou's career kind of came to a halt, at least temporarily. Against Tyson Fury, Francis Ngannou looked exceptional, my personal opinion, for a guy that's entering the boxing ring for the first time ever, according to my knowledge, that is. Put down Tyson Fury is something that's never been done prior to that. In my personal opinion, he was robbed the night against Tyson Fury, and then he went on to face Anthony Joshua in a fight that Joshua was absolutely perfect in. I mean, that has to be said. Although I do believe that Francis Ngannou did not take that fight as serious as he should have or could have. And he learned his lesson the hard way against Anthony Joshua. I really do believe that Francis Ngannou underestimated Joshua's powers to put him away. And he overestimated his own power in putting Joshua away, just stood right in front of Joshua. And really, it was three identical punches that ultimately ended the fight between Joshua and Ngannou. Now, that being said, what I'm trying to say here is that Francis Ngannou not only conquered the world of MMA, specifically the UFC, perhaps the best MMA organization out there. I want to go far saying that the UFC is perhaps the best fighting or combat sports organization on the planet. I'm not sure about other organizations and their finances, but in terms of just peak performance, from top athletes in terms of MMA, the UFC is the place to go. So Francis Ngannou conquered the world of MMA. He has had blemishes against a guy in the name of Stipe Miocic, and that was quickly fixed. The guy did look indestructible at some point. I mean, like I said, if you've never seen the Francis Ngannou Jairzinho Rozenstruik fight, a very short fight, you got to go watch that one. And when you watch that fight, you're going to see something on pure display, and that's Francis Ngannou's terrifying power. I still believe that it's one of one. And Francis Ngannou, despite the loss to Anthony Joshua, the way that he lost to Anthony Joshua, I don't want to say it was embarrassing, but the game plan was certainly embarrassing. Just the way they I really believe that Joshua was underestimated the night that he fought Francis Ngannou. That's why Joshua looked as good as he did. But we have to give Joshua his credit. Nonetheless, Francis Ngannou conquered the world of UFC, MMA, heavyweight champion, faced the who's who in that division, and also the way he was knocking out guys was just terrifying, to say the least. And he went on to the boxing world. He put down Tyson Fury, arguably one of the best fighters of all time, combat sports fighters, period, boxing, whatever. Tyson Fury most certainly is up there. I do believe that some people will disagree, but I just look at Tyson Fury as one of the best fighters in the past 20 years, at least in the heavyweight division world of boxing. Also, he went on to face Anthony Joshua. I believe losing to Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury takes nothing away from Francis Ngannou, whose first two fights came against the best boxers on the planet, right? Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury. I mean, you couldn't have picked harder fights. He could have picked easier opponents, but he went straight to the top. That being said, Francis Ngannou, I believe, has cemented his name in the hearts and minds of true combat sports lovers. This is something that's ingrained in the hearts and minds of true combat sports lovers. Just like the name of Chuck Liddell is ingrained, the name of George St. Pierre, the name of Manny Pacquiao, the name of Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson, George Foreman, you name it. We can go down a list, and we might forget some names. Israel Adesanya, former middleweight champion, and the fighter that has a fight against the current middleweight champion Dricus the night of, I believe, August 17th, UFC 305 in Perth, Australia. Super stoked, excited for this one. Has had a few comments in regards to his friend, Francis Ngannou. Okay? I believe Adesanya is from Nigeria. Francis Ngannou is from Cameroon. Both African natives. Israel Adesanya seems to think that the UFC is trying hard enough, or really hard rather, to erase the legacy and history of Francis Ngannou. Now, how can we take these statements from Israel Adesanya, and what makes Israel Adesanya say such thing? First and foremost, there has to be a reason why Izzy's saying what he said. Number one. Number two, yes, we don't hear about Francis Ngannou much in the UFC. That being said, there are reasons why that's happened. I remember when Francis was still in the organization, the UFC that is. If I'm not mistaken, during those times, which is a couple years ago at this point, 2-3 years ago, probably around that or maybe a little longer, there was news circulating of Francis Ngannou asking for ridiculous ridiculous amounts of money to re-enter that octagon. The type of money that only Conor McGregor perhaps could ask for. I don't know who else could generate millions and millions of dollars each fight. It's only Conor McGregor. In the UFC, we're only talking about Conor. That's why Conor is so special to the world of MMA, specifically the UFC. I remember the negotiations weren't going anywhere. And ultimately, that led the two parties to part ways. Francis Ngannou went to make his money in the world of boxing. I do understand that Dana White is not the biggest fan of seeing his fighters enter boxing rings. I know that for a fact. And there's good reasons why. Obviously, you don't have to look far. In order for this statement to really hit home. Every time MMA fighter goes into a boxing ring, embarrassing things happen. We would really like for the opposite to be true, because we all know how the opposite, if the opposite was to happen, we all know the results of such fights, right? If a boxer would to enter a octagon. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that there were negotiations that did not go anywhere between the UFC and Francis Ngannou. Francis was asking for ridiculous amounts of money, allegedly. This is a couple years back. And he kind of put Dana White in the UFC, in a corner, sort of saying. Ultimately, the two parties had to part ways. Francis Ngannou, like I said, went on to make his money. I'm pretty sure he made pretty good amount of money in the world of boxing in these two fights, though he was handed back-to-back losses. And the last time Francis Ngannou was in boxing ring, it was quite frankly embarrassing for Ngannou, right? So that being said, the guy's effectively no longer, he has not been a UFC fighter for a very long time at this point. And the two parties have parted ways. Plus, on top of that, Dana White is not the biggest fan of seeing his fighters enter boxing rings. I'm sure if Dana had something to say about it, I don't think that he would be in favor of seeing Ngannou enter boxing, especially against Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua. I really thought that the Anthony Joshua was going to be an easier fight than the Francis Ngannou than the Tyson Fury fight. Obviously, that was not the case. Nonetheless, the fight against Anthony Joshua was embarrassing. It was not only embarrassing for Francis Ngannou as an individual, but it was embarrassing for the UFC because this guy was the heavyweight champion of the UFC. So seeing your heavyweight champion being dropped the way that he was against Anthony Joshua was just embarrassing, to say the least. And I could see why the UFC would not want to mention Ngannou anymore, with all respect to Francis Ngannou, but there are a couple of reasons. Number one, this is a business, right? This is not the Hall of Fame is like a memorabilia page for the UFC, but in terms of the active live life of UFC, I don't see why why the UFC has to have a reason to promote or advertise a previous champion like Francis Ngannou. I don't know why they should promote or advertise a previous champion like Georges St. Pierre. I do understand that these guys will always have the respect and room in the UFC, right? But I don't think the UFC is necessarily obligated to advertise a Francis Ngannou, a former champion who did not leave on a good note. This is just personal opinion. I don't think there's really anything to be offended from, in all honesty. I believe that, with all respect to, obviously, Adesanya here, but there's not much to be erased, in all honesty. Like I've said it earlier in this video, in the hearts and minds of true combat sports lovers, especially those who are fans of Francis Ngannou, him not being advertised on a UFC screen is not necessarily going to make them forget about the guy. History cannot be changed or erased. That's for certain. Francis Ngannou is still one of the most respected fighters on the planet. He's still, I'm pretty sure, a feared fighter for whoever enters a combat sports arena against him. And, I believe, I'm not sure where Francis Ngannou fighting next. I'm not sure what organization he's signed to, perhaps the PFL. But whenever Francis Ngannou fights next, perhaps many of us will be tuned in. He's just not in the forefront of things. And what I mean by forefront of things is that when we're talking about combat sports, the UFC is most certainly the forefront. And if you have not earned your spot in the forefront, then I don't see why the UFC has to advertise you. Simple as that. If you made it this far, I appreciate you for sticking around. Please let me know what you think in the comments and like, subscribe for more.